So this short video is designed to introduce you to our Designing for Sustained Adoption Assessment instrument to help you in evaluating the structured summaries. The complete resource is available on our website. Remind you about where to find that and how to use some of these resources. So the idea is instead of a full proposal, you'll be evaluating structured summaries, and we've had you basically summarize important pieces that would go into a complete propagation plan, reminding you that in your full proposal, you're not going to have a separate section that says propagation plan. This will be interwoven as you describe your narrative and how you're going to conduct your project itself. If you were using this outside of PeerMark, we've created a rating form where you would just be able to circle the appropriate letters or rankings. However, with PeerMark, you can't import that directly, so we've made a few modifications. So the instrument itself is divided into 4 sections, and in your review, you're going to take care of 3 of these. So you'll do some evaluation of the product type, which is a descriptive section, the product features, which is also descriptive, so these are just describing what you see as what's being disseminated. We also have a section that you won't complete using PeerMark that goes through all of the specific propagation activities that are being used. And then the last section is where you actually evaluate how well you think the author has met the expectations of effective propagation strategies. So if you want to download the instrument itself, which I would highly recommend, if you go to the website under resources, there's a link to the Designing for Sustained Adoption Assessment instrument there, and you can print it out and have it to where you can see all of the categories and the full descriptions of each aspect. So the first thing you're going to do is look at the product type. And so you're really deciding what is being developed. What is it that is going to be adopted? You can see Chapter 3 in the how-to guide if you want to read more of that, which you'll be doing for our first session. But you don't have to have read it in order to do your initial summary and evaluation. So the first 2 review questions relate to the product type. So the first thing is to decide what's the product, what's being propagated, and then to do it as a code. So in terms of what's being propagated, you're going to write a sentence or a phrase that's your best determination of what you think the authors are trying to have propagated. Once you've done that, then you'll look at the rubric where we've developed a set of categories of different product types. These can include just looking at implementations, where you don't really have to change the pedagogy of the course, implementations where you're changing the pedagogy but not the course content, just changing the content itself, and then where you do both. And then we have subcategories. So if you felt like the product in the proposal you're evaluating was a flexible instructional tool, then you would mark C2A. If you looked and went, well, I can't tell if this is C2A or C2B or some combination of the two, or that it requires new pedagogy but doesn't quite fit any of the rest of them, then you could just mark C2, and that gives you kind of a broader sweep. When you're using the rubric itself, the PeerMark, you're just going to type the code in the box. So if you had selected C2A, you would just type C2A in the text box. The next task then is to really analyze the product features. And again, this is a descriptive component of the instrument where you're going to look at what kinds of changes are involved and what kind of effort is required for adoption. And this is an important first step because the nature of what adopters have to do should influence what the project developers are doing in order to support adoption. So for this section, you're going to use a rating scale. PeerMark restricts you to a 1 to 5. You have to use the numerical scale. So for our features, it'll require a slight modification, but it's pretty straightforward. So in walking you through this part of the rubric or the instrument, you'll notice the first column is unable to rate. So if you're not quite sure from what you've read in the summary or in a proposal, that would be what you would mark. And this was not an uncommon experience for us in rating proposals. It wasn't always clear from the project descriptions what the developers really expected adopters to do. So if we look at feature 1, what's the amount of user modification? This ranges from completely prescribed, where you expect the adopters to use materials as is and implement it exactly like the developers, to completely emergent, where you essentially expect adopters to be inspired by what you're doing and do their own thing. Most proposals are in category B and C, where they're partially prescribed or partially emergent, depending how much user modification you expect people to do. The next section is degree of change to teaching practices. So again, it may be a development where instructors don't have to make any changes to their typical teaching approach. This may be a course add-on or something that really doesn't require any changes, to a considerable amount of change where people would radically change their approach. Means they'd have to undergo significant training. They may need a lot more support. They're going to need to spend some time. This, of course, requires you to make a judgment call as to what typical practice is. So if you're talking about radical change, you have to decide what the starting point is. So in answering this questions, we typically decided that typical teaching practices was primarily a didactic presentation, where the instructor presents material and the students transcribe notes based on what they've heard. If your target audience really has been defined as somebody for whom that's not their typical practice, that should be clear that what your starting point is and what you would like the revised practice to be. Third component is the degree of cooperation required to adopt. So is this something that an instructor can do on their own, that they don't have to consult with anybody, to something that you have to get everybody in the department on board, maybe multiple departments, and that you would have to get your department chair or your dean or somebody in the institutional hierarchy to approve adopting this product. And then the last category is degree of resources, where this is something I could adopt. It wouldn't cost my department anything, up into something where you might have to build new classrooms, buy expensive instrumentation. So it's a judgment of what would be required. So go through, decide what all of your rankings are for the product itself based on what you can glean from the project description. One thing, as I noted, PeerMark doesn't let you do an able to rate A, B, C, D. So you're going to need to change this to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have this as letters in the instrument itself because it's descriptive, and having numbers implies that 5 is better than 1. In this case, it's not. It's just a change we have to make to use the software. So the next task, which you won't use in the PeerMark, but it will make it much easier to complete the last section, is to go through and analyze what are the specific propagation activities being used. And so it's just a categorization of what you see about what's planned for development, dissemination, and support. And this is a case where more is not necessarily better. What you're looking for is fit. So you're just going to go through and read each component, put a mark whether this is going to happen in the early stages, in the revision stage, or in the expansion stage of the proposal. And so you're basically just marking X's. And this is a way for you to have thought about what are they really proposing to do. Again, sometimes it may just not be really clear based on the project description. But this will put you, make you better prepared to then do the evaluative part of the instrument, which is where you're really evaluating the propagation plan. So here we've done categories that are based on the literature for strategies that have been identified as necessary for supportive of successful propagation. So in this case, the numbers actually do mean something. A low score means there's little evidence. A high score says there's a lot of evidence that the project team is following best practices. Remember, this is as you go through, especially this first time using the instrument, that many proposals may score lowly, including your own. Even funded proposals that we have evaluated, many of them aren't well aligned with best practices, and that's part of the purpose of the workshop, is to help you move your project proposal to score higher as you develop more expertise and insights into some of these practices. So as you can see, we've got the same type of setup here, where you're first looking at the intended audience. And so based on structured summaries, you should have an easier time of this since the authors had to explicitly say who their intended audience is. So hopefully nobody gets a 1 here. But then you're looking at how detailed that audience is. Is it a general, which is what we frequently see? I want chemistry faculty or I want engineering faculty to adopt this. Or do you get more detail? And so you can read the descriptors and decide how well the authors have identified their audience. And these are people who are going to make the decision to adopt the product. So do keep in mind that it's who makes the decision, not necessarily who uses it. So while students may be your ultimate users, it's the faculty member who decides whether or not they use it for most of these innovations. The next component is, do they engage intended adopters? Typical practice is people don't think about engaging with adopters until their projects are done. And so we're looking at how well are they interacting with that target audience or a subset, a few selected members of that audience all the way through the project. And again, then A3 is looking at them from the very beginning of the project. Are you just thinking about making it useful, or are you getting people involved to help in your decision making early on? So you can read the components and you would do the same thing. You would mark where you find that proposal to be, and you'll see that things can be all over the place, that they don't always stay in the same column as we go through and assess them. The number of the column, you would then mark that number on the peer mark evaluation form. And then the last 3 questions take a bit broader look. So A4, we're looking at the different aspects of the instructional system. Have you thought about where your adopters work and the things that are going to influence their decision making? The level of thoroughness, this one may be a little hard the first time or two that you use the rubric, but you'll get a better sense of it as you get more experience, is really thinking about, did you see all of the pieces? Have they really addressed all of the components, or are they just implied? Is there some rationale for the decisions they've made in the proposals? And again, you may not see all of these in the structured summaries, but hopefully in your final project proposal, you'll have included more of that information. And then it's an assessment of the propagation strategies matching the product type. So this is why looking at the features of the product and then looking at their dissemination activities. If this is a product that instructors don't have to change their teaching practice, it doesn't require any cooperation, it doesn't require any resources, then the level of engagement and support is a lot less than a product that requires people to make significant changes to their teaching practice, gain support of their department. There you would expect the developers to have a lot more components in place. And so you're making some judgment about what is it that they want adopters to do, and then what are they doing to help make those changes or encourage people to make them. So that is the instrument in a nutshell. We will discuss the ratings and the instrument in a little bit more detail in our first workshop session. I hope to see you then.